Welcome. I'm David Blight. I direct the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition. And we've done a number of events over 20 years that have particularly focused on that middle word, resistance. I think this one does too, among other things. I just want to announce a couple of quick things and then get right at a conversation with Ibram Kendi. We have a major conference in a month, or is it only 3 weeks now? On November 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. It's called Fighting Modern Slavery, What Works? At the Gilder Lehrman Center, we've had an initiative to study human trafficking and modern slavery now for 5 or 6 years. We've had no less than 9 research fellows in all kinds of disciplines come through as modern slavery scholars. Our current one is Lou DeBaca, who's here today, the former ambassador of human trafficking in the Obama administration. And we're drawing together an international group of writers, scholars, again, many disciplines represented, who will tackle this question: what methods, what efforts, what kinds of movements against the current problem of modern slavery and human trafficking have worked, which haven't, which ought to work. That's a very disputed, controversial question in that field, as you will learn, but it's a very useful question. And the base of that conference is a working group that we've sponsored now for almost 2 years of about 15 or so international scholars and writers who study this question. So anyway, November 1st to the 3rd, please sign up. And if any of you are not, for some reason, on our mailing list, our email list, our newsletter list, please give your email before you leave to Michelle Zacks, who's in the orange sweater down here, or to Tom Thurston, who will put his hand up over there. He's got the great curly hair over there. You can't miss it, Tom. He's great at other things. But, anyway, welcome. There's another event in December. On December 6th, we have Ta-Nehisi Coates coming to campus, whom a lot of you have read. And he's going to conduct a conversation with me. I get to be on the other side about a new book on Douglass. Ta-Nehisi, as some of you probably know, grew up in Baltimore. He grew up a great admirer of Douglass. He knows his Douglass. And supposedly he's reading my book. I hope so. Anyway, I want to introduce quickly Ibram Kendi and then talk about this remarkable book that has now been out for a couple of years. He's a professor at American University, but before that, he did his bachelor's degree at NYU. Actually, no, at Florida A&M, excuse me. You did some work at NYU, forgive me, Florida A&M. I know that when people mess up the BA or the BS, yours is a BS. I especially hate it when they say I got my bachelor's degree at Michigan. It's at Michigan State, and that is a mortal sin to say that. Anyway, did his graduate work at Temple University, PhD at Temple. He has taught at Albany State in New York. He's also taught at Brown for a year, and he is now in American Studies, or African American Studies, at American University, where he directs a center, a new center. The center is called AntiRacist Research and Policy Center, and it's connected to the Department of History at American U. It's a unique center. There's really no other center quite devoted in the same way to the question of anti-racism as this new center is. They have all sorts of initiatives going, and I want to talk with Ibram about that. They have a team system they've structured. I want you to talk a little bit about that. They also have an initiative going with the Frederick Douglass Family Initiative. Maybe you can talk about that as well. Now, Ibram's first book, which was, I think, a dissertation, is entitled The Black Campus Movement, Black Students and the Radical Reconstitution of Higher Education in 1965-1972. It's the second book we're going to talk about here tonight that won the National Book Award, entitled Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, published by Nation Books in 2016. And Ibram tells the remarkable story that you can pick up on of getting that award, I think only a day or two after the 2016 election, which made a rather somber evening much more thrilling, I hope. But anyway, you can tell that. There's a third book in the works now entitled How to Be an Anti-Racist, A Memoir of My Journey. Ibram's arrived already at the point of writing a memoir about this. Stamped from the Beginning is not a memoir. It is a remarkable 500-year history of an intellectual history mostly, of ideas, but also a book, those of you who have read it know this, it is a book full of mini biographies of all sorts of people. It's a book divided into 5 parts by 5 names of Americans, and I'd like to come back to that with you too, of how and why you chose those 5 names to hang these 5 vast eras of American history on. It is a book that is, I don't want to use the word balanced. It's complicated, ironic, complex, at times even ambivalent. But it doesn't just choose sides about who's a racist and who's an anti-racist in the past. The abolition movement gets a roughing over in this book, but it also has great admiration for certain abolitionists. Well into the 20th century, it takes on major iconic figures of the Black protest movement and American history for this problem of just what was racist and anti-racist, and how did the two collide and meet and inform each other through time. It is a bold book, and for good reason. It has gotten enormous attention. And we're here today to basically talk about it for a half hour or 40 minutes, and then all of you get to pipe right in too. I think we have mics, we do have mics out in the audience. I actually want to begin with a piece you just published in the Atlantic, if that's okay. That's fine. It's a piece called A House Still Divided. It's in the current, I think it's current, October 18 issue of the Atlantic, where Ibram, you argue that the current threat of racism is more insidious now than it has been in the past, and you lay out a host of ways that you see that or you believe that's the case. Could you lay out that argument a little bit?
Sure. Well, good evening, everyone. It's truly an honor to be here. Thank you so much, David, for organizing, for your staff for organizing this talk. Of course, I know you're touring, and so to be able to
I'm touring with you right here now.
It's truly, I think it's, hopefully we'll have a nice conversation. This piece in the Atlantic, I decided, so it's the issue itself is asking the question, is democracy dying? And a series of sort of authors sort of seek to answer that question. And I make the case that it is dying, and it's dying because of this divided house. And so, of course, speaking from Lincoln's 1858 speech, but I make the case that the current division is between racism and anti-racism. Mm-hmm. And just as Lincoln said that the nation will either become all one or all the other, meaning slavery or anti-slavery, I think it's the same thing for racism and anti-racism. And in the piece, very quickly, I think many of you are very familiar with all of the different ways in which people's votes are being suppressed. I think many of you are familiar with the fact that people are arming themselves, believing that their people, particularly white people, are facing a genocide and killing people, as a result. I think many of you are familiar with sort of many different ways in which, and I just really wanted to sort of lay out this dialectic. and I wanted to sort of push back, as I try to do in Stamped, against the dialectic of racism and not racism. You know, I really wanted to sort of show this collision, and hopefully I was able to do that.
Well, I think you did. I mean, it is if you haven't read it, it is a sobering little punch between the eyes, playing off the house divided language of Lincoln's, and you're suggesting we're in a house divided between racism and anti-racism, and you say, just like Lincoln said, we will either become all one or all the other. Take that home tonight or tomorrow. Anyway, indeed. Now, you wrote this. I don't know exactly when you wrote Stamped, but you were writing it during the Obama years, maybe even the later Obama years.
Yes, the second term.
Right. So much was going on.
That's a mistake.
Yeah, I know. I mean, the police shootings,
Yes.
Charleston. Well, it was done before Charlottesville, but Charleston's in 2015, so maybe you had the book done by then. I don't know.
Well, really, the period was Trayvon
Martin,
and
right.
Sandra Bland. That was really the period.
So this new phenomenon of white supremacy and racism and violence is bursting out in America as you're writing this book. But the book you're writing is from the colonial period, even before the colonial period, all the way through the 20th century. And you're doing a deep history here at the same time. Could you talk a little bit about that? A lot of us have had to do this or thought about doing this or try to do this. Graduate students here in the audience, you know, we have lots of discussions about how does one mix one's scholarship with activism? How do you know when it's your activism on the page you just wrote? And how do you know when you're still a scholar? What do you remember about that dilemma or that problem? Of what's going on right in front of you in the society while you're writing about Cotton Mather or Jefferson or Douglass or whoever?
I think I remember, two major problems. The first is clearly if you're writing a book of this length, I'm sorry, it's a little bit long, it takes quite a bit of time, and so probably for 2 years I was working upwards of 12 hours a day on it. At the same time, I wanted to not be at my computer working on this book. You know, I wanted to be in the streets with other people. And so I think having to sort of restrict myself and keep myself and recognize, or at least I thought and hoped, that this would have been my sort of, this would have been more effective use of my specific time.
Sure.
Was very difficult because I saw the ways in which people were being harmed in a number of different types of ways. And I felt almost as if that should be me. And I feel like, am I sort of convincing myself to stay out of harm's way? I mean, there's all types of intellectual exchanges going on. The other thing, and I think from the sort of the notion of the scholar, I think for me, the work came in very early on. In other words, I think once I was able to define a racist idea and an anti-racist idea, once I was able to define, and we'll go into this later, a segregationist idea and assimilationist idea, that really, I mean, for me, if there was any sort of inflection of politics, it was really through that. But once you define it in a clear way, then as an historian, you just go in search, of those ideas, and then you, of course, write those ideas out.
But I have to tell you, as a historian myself, in reading your book, one has I'm not, you know, I'll try to think of critical things too, but it's amazing how much reading you did for this. It's amazing how many different kinds of historical periods and forces. You know, the past is always different, and then the past has so many pasts. I mean, you had to get your head around everything from Puritanism to modernity to you name it to do this. And you had to read some biographies because there's a lot of people. You do these 2-page, 3-page, or if it's Angela Davis or Du Bois or Garrison, you do many more pages.
Mm-hmm.
How did you organize? I mean, as a writer, I want to know, how did you organize writing a book like this? 500 years of this idea of racism and anti-racism over time. Who do you choose? How do you pick? What criteria? How did you do that?
It was fluid. Certainly, I think in the broadest
Books
stroke-
do happen, sort
Yeah.
of, right?
Yeah.
We think we write them, but sometimes it just happens.
Well, I think I probably created it was probably like a 500-page outline, chronological outline that was also thematic, and so when I was sort of researching, I was sort of filling in that. And when I say chronological but also thematic, as many of you know, you take a novel, for instance, you have this sort of scene, and then at certain parts of the scene they go back on a particular theme, right? It's this sort of same thing. And so I did that, and I sort of poured all of the research into that sort of massive writing outline. And then after I sort of finished researching, which I guess I never really finished researching because, even as I was writing, I was still researching. I then went back through.
That's the scariest part. It's
Yeah.
never over,
Exactly.
but it has to be.
Yes, which is another story. But I went back through, and then I went back through and sort of reconceived or prepared the writing outline for writing. And so I had to sort of go through all of these concepts and make connections and really think through how it's sort of righted. And I think that's one of the reasons I think I was able to be effective, because I spent so much time sort of on that writing outline, and it made the writing that much easier.
But from the beginning, you were planning the whole 500 years.
So that was,
We could get lost in the weeds here, just
Yeah.
two writers trying to understand how the hell do you do this, But
so I mean, as you know, many scholars make the case that racist ideas really emerged in the 1800s, early 1800s. And so that's where I started. But once again, taking this definition, once I started going back, I saw ideas in the 1770s, and then I went back and saw them in the 1670s, and I kept going back and saw them in the 1500s. And so, I think the definition itself and staying true to that definition and looking based on that definition, I think was critical, and then not necessarily being scared, for the lack of a better term, to go against the dominant sort of chronology.
Okay.
And really just stick with that definition. I think that was critical.
Could you quickly lay out that, not everyone's read this
Sure.
book, the definition you used of racist and anti-racist and segregationist and assimilationist?
Sure. So I defined a racist idea as any idea that suggests a racial group is superior or inferior to another racial group in any way. And Stand from the beginning was a history of anti-black racist ideas. And so I was looking for ideas suggesting that there was something inferior about a particular black racial group. And I say black racial group because, as many of you know, black people are not a monolith. They're literally a collection of racialized groups. So you have ideas that have been created to denigrate black women, black men, black poor, black elites, black students, right? And you can go on, which is one of the reasons why the book was long. And so there was that. And then anti-racist ideas are obviously quite the opposite. It's ideas suggesting that the racial groups are equal, or equals, I should say. And then when we think about racist ideas, I found, and this is really what caused me to write the book in and of itself, that generally speaking, historians and even other scholars had defined a racist idea in a more narrow way, focusing specifically on notions of biological racial hierarchy.
In the
and
tradition of
distinction.
science.
Precisely. And so what sort of led me to write the book was, it was sort of coming out of my first book and my research on black student activism in the late 60s, black student activists who were, pushing for African American studies, saying that the current disciplines in the academy were racist. But at the time, in the late 1960s, these ideas about biological hierarchy and distinction were marginal. These weren't the ideas that were dominating the academy in the late 60s. The ideas that were dominating the academy in the late 60s were notions of cultural hierarchy or behavioral hierarchy. And so these students were classifying these notions of black people as pathological as racist ideas. But of course, those definitions had never made their way, into the scholarship. And so I, of course, wanted to bring that in. And ultimately, I defined the more traditional, for the lack of a better term, type of racist ideas as segregationist ideas. So these are notions of biological racial hierarchy, making the case that a particular racial group is therefore permanently inferior.
By nature.
By nature. Yeah. And then I showed, and then the second type of racist idea was making the case that racial groups, or in the case of Stand from the Beginning, black people, were not inferior by nature, but inferior by nurture. And so they weren't inferior as a result of their genes or the biology, they were inferior as a result of their environment, their culture, their behavior. And assimilationist.
And even a Garrison fit into that. Right?
Precisely. And so assimilationists, as I identify them, typically made the case that black people were either culturally or behaviorally inferior. But then they were like, well, since they're not innately or biologically inferior, we can and should civilize and develop them. Right. While segregationists were like, no, you can't civilize and develop them. You need to kill them, segregate them, incarcerate them, or deport them.
Right. Well, thank you. I mean, that boils a lot of ideas down to 4 workable definitions. And I can imagine your process of deciding, okay, finally got my definitions, now I can go. Can I ask you,
Sure.
You divide the book in 5 parts. Now there's a lot going on in these parts, but you give each of them a name, a person. Can I just name the person? You can tell us why you chose it. I mean, I find that fascinating. Colonial period, Cotton Mather. Go first with Cotton Mather.
Sure, I think Yalians know a little bit about Cotton Mather.
Well, they may not.
His ghost may be around here somewhere. How dare you? But
he's not one of those. Well, maybe he is. I don't know.
So Cotton Mather, for those of you who don't know, he was involved in the naming of Yale University. But Cotton Mather was the longtime pastor in Boston of what was called the North Church. His father was Increase Mather, who was a longtime president of Harvard, as well as the previous pastor of the North Church. The North Church was the most prominent church in Boston. And his grandfather was Richard Mather, who helped found Harvard and who was in the first sort of migration of university-trained intellectuals to New England in the 1630s. And so this was the sort of Mather dynasty that historians had really talked about. And Cotton Mather was more illustrious than both his father and grandfather. He was the first American to be inducted into the Royal Society. I'm saying all this to say that he was a pivotal intellectual figure in colonial America. His biographers make the case that he published more than all of his contemporaries combined. But he was also a pivotal figure in discussions of race. And so in the colonial era, there was a debate going on about whether black people can become Christian. And Cotton Mather...
And if they are, what happens?
Yeah, precisely why there was a debate, right? Slave owners were like, no, they can't become Christian because in British common law, if you become Christian, you become free. So they were like, no. Well, Cotton Mather made the case that they could become Christian. And the way he went about making that case was to say we need to, as St. Paul does, divide the body from the soul. The body can be enslaved, but we need to proselytize to the soul. And when we do, and that soul, that black soul becomes Christian, that black soul also becomes white. And so this he was critical in the formation of assimilationist ideas, because historically, assimilationists have sought to make black people white.
This is fascinating. I hope this doesn't sound like your orals exams now. No. But Age of Revolution, Thomas Jefferson.
So
you can have that.
Sure. So in the
Master
colonial
time.
era, the science was largely theological. By early America, science or intellectual ideas started to become more secular. And they specifically started to become more secular due to the influence of Thomas Jefferson. As many of you know, he wasn't that religious. Even though he, of course, he was adamant about religious freedom, he himself wasn't that religious. And his major sort of literary text, of course, was a nonfiction text. And I just wanted to show, and I think I show in the text, how his ideals on race were critical in shaping the debate on race in early America. And not only in the early United States, but even part of this trans-Atlantic Enlightenment debate over notions of creation. And so he was pivotal, and then he, of course, dies on the eve of the abolitionist movement. And so part of the consideration of characters, or major characters, was not only them being a pivotal figure, central figure in the racial debate, but also their time frames.
They are, and off of Jefferson, you can do a lot of intellectual history of a lot of other people.
Precisely.
The third section of the book, you hang it on William Lloyd Garrison, which was a very interesting choice.
Yeah, and so, I mean, I think this period was certainly a period I could have chosen many different people.
Sure.
Of course, Douglas could have, David may have not have been happy, or he may have been happy about that, I don't know. But, you know, I think,
quote him a lot, and really,
of course.
really nicely.
But I think first his lifetime, particularly his public life, spanned from roughly 1829, so 3 years after Jefferson's death, to the end of Reconstruction. And so clearly, when you're thinking about periods in American history, you know, that's really a critical sort of period that we can sort of slice off. And secondly, of course, he was a pivotal intellectual figure in the racial debate. And I think what and another reason why I picked him was because he popularized quite possibly the most seductive racist idea, a racist idea that is still very prominent within the community of people who consider themselves liberal, even progressive, or even radical. And that is, in his case, he made the case that slavery wasn't just dehumanizing, that this oppressive, violent system was literally dehumanizing black people. He often talks about slavery making black people into brutes. And I sort of track this sort of what I've later, since the book, called the oppression inferiority thesis. To first it was slavery making black people into brutes, then it was segregation, right? Now it's poverty, right? Other people have made the case, other sort of types of sort of things, but this idea that racism itself or discrimination wasn't just sort of harming people, but it was literally leading to inferior behaviors. Was a case that he made, and he made that case to sort of shock Americans into seeing how bad slavery is.
And he had huge influence.
Precisely.
I mean,
yes.
God, we could stop on any one. Actually, let's stop on this one a moment. This is the period, of course, I work on. I think you're doing a particularly deft job with Harriet Beecher Stowe, the most popular book of the 19th century for sure, and one of the most popular ever. Anyone's ever read it or taught it knows it's fraught with problems about race. At the same time, it is this book that revolutionized the 1850s, exploded on the scene like no other book ever. But talk about that a little bit. And there's actually a little paragraph passage I was even going to read and have you respond to, but I'll let you go first. Talk about how you handle Harriet Beecher Stowe and that book.
So
Called Uncle Tom's Cabin, in case you
yes.
that book.
So I think many of the books and periods were, to a certain extent, a revelation for me. And I think researching the circumstances and the intellectual influence of her book is still sort of eye-popping for me, like even to this day.
It's all over the place.
Yeah, I mean, it
it's
was
cultural influences all over the world.
Yeah, when you think of the 19th century, you had the Bible, then Uncle Tom's Cabin in terms of bestsellers. I mean, but two, I think first.
And P.T. Barnum, he was up there too.
Yes. So, has anybody heard the concept that black people have soul? I'm sure you're like, yes. So that concept, that black people have soul, stemmed, I argue, in this text from Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin made the case that black people are more predisposed to Christianity than white people were. But not only that, that's because one of the reasons why black people were predisposed to Christianity was because they were predisposed to servility or to being dependent or to being slaves. So of course the pro-slavery argument that, yeah, I mean, slavery is good for black people, like they're sort of predisposed to this. She actually met Americans where they were, believing that, and then made the case that, so this idea actually makes them predisposed to Christianity. In contrast, white people, she argued, who are predisposed to freedom and ruling, are therefore not predisposed to Christianity. And so the way white America can essentially become more Christian and do away with this sort of character trait was through liberating black people. Does everybody sort of get that? I mean, it was a very powerful sort of statement. Like, you know, you can get closer to God, white America, by becoming abolitionists. I mean, that was essentially the argument.
And she embedded it in unforgettable characters.
Oh, precisely.
Not just the ideas, but the characters.
And of course, she, in order to make that case, she had to make black people these hyper-religious beings that had soul and nobody else had it, right? And then that positive construct, of course, like many racial constructs that were actually denigrating to black people sort of started hugging it, like notions that black people are better at, more athletic. I mean, we can go down the list. And of course, that's transferred to this day. Another quick influence of that text was this idea that the races would complement each other. So you had the dependent African and the independent European. And what we needed to do was sort of, instead of imagining one is superior to the other and creating this sort of dividing ideal of race, we need to create the unifying ideal of race and bring these two constructs together. I'm using terminology that W.B. Du Bois used in The Souls of Black Folk. So it's hard, it was just fascinating to me how Du Bois, coming up in New England,
which is the fourth part of the book. That's Du
Yes.
Bois. Go. Du Bois is number 4.
he, of course, like many people in New England, his ideas about race were largely dominated and molded through these constructions that Harriet Beecher Stowe laid out in Uncle Tom's Cabin.
He had some trouble overcoming the 19th century in which he was born.
Exactly.
And raised and educated.
Yeah, and because people typically, I mean, if you read sort of Stories of Black Folk in concert with Uncle Tom's Cabin, I mean, I think you can see those sort of connections. I try to flesh those out in the book, that he literally talked about race as a biological construct, that each race had its own destiny, that You had the sort of hard European and the soft African, as he made the case in his graduation speech from Harvard. And so, these were ideas that he took from Uncle Tom's Cabin.
And he's hardly alone.
Oh,
in
no.
this late 19th, early 20th century era, among black thinkers, white thinkers, there are all kinds of variations of this, but right up to the Harlem Renaissance.
Oh, yes.
I mean, especially in the Harlem Renaissance. Okay, the fifth part, Angela Davis.
So,
Why'd you choose Angela Davis?
So again, I think her public career. So Du Bois dies on the eve of the March on Washington. Of course, Angela Davis becomes a public figure when Black Power sort of explodes onto the American scene, and of course has remained a public figure since 1969. That was critical. Another aspect of Angela Davis is she has been at the forefront of an issue that we have now begun to talk about in the last 10 years, which of course is the carceral state, which of course is mass incarceration. This is something she's been talking about and fighting against since the 1960s. Another reason I chose Angela Davis is because I wanted to have at least one character who steadily articulated anti-racist ideas throughout her lifetime.
Who sustained it throughout, yeah.
Precisely, and someone who, unlike the previous four characters and many other people articulated or sort of described in the book, was constantly defending the most denigrated and vulnerable group, Black racial group, whether you're talking about incarcerated people, whether you're talking about Black single mothers. I mean, she was typically at the forefront of defending these people before it was fashionable.
Well, okay, there you got the 5 parts of the book. I find that move fascinating, of kind of hanging an entire era, even a century, on a person and then going from there. But that is kind of what we do with intellectual history. We need a person first, and then, yeah. Anyway, also I want to say, you were trained as a journalist too.
Yes.
And it shows in the writing, folks. You're very good at setting scenes, very good at opening narratives that are not yet about the ideas. The ideas are coming in later. Back to the writing, just for a moment. How did you think about that as a writer? I mean, you have a narrative opening to every chapter in the book. Sometimes it's biographical, sometimes it's not. But that's writerly. You're not just talking about ideas here, that's writerly, and that's very conscious for you, I think.
Well, I think the reason actually why I chose the 5 characters is the same reason why I tried to create these scenes, and that is I want to make the book accessible.
Fair enough.
And as you would imagine, I know if somebody was to tell me, hey, you should read this 500-page book on intellectual history, I'm gonna be like, no, I'm not gonna. Anybody who's read intellectual history knows, I mean, it's hard to read those types of books.
From St. Paul to Darwin in 500 pages.
Yes. And so, but I think intellectual histories are critical, books, because really they show the transformation of ideas and concepts over time, and even show when ideas that we hold or that are dominant in our era, when they sort of emerged, and the context in which they emerged. But so I wanted to figure out a way to, of course, write an intellectual history that was accessible as possible, for people, because I would imagine that generally these types of books are not accessible. And the way that I did that was I probably added a few hundred pages of scenes and other types of character development to sort of allow the reader to actually enjoy what they're reading on some level.
Yeah, especially on a unhappy subject, let's face it, yeah. Because you're writing about real people, and they are very real. Can we go back and dive down a little bit before we go to Q&A on just the abolitions for a moment? I mean, the American abolitionist, which we just discussed in my graduate seminar 1 hour ago. We were reading Manisha Sinha's book and a few other things. Here you have the prototypical American reform movement. Every anti-whatever in the future, every crusade for women's rights, gay rights, environmentalism, all movements after the abolitionists owe something to this first great movement, its methods, its techniques, its uses of modernity and the press and all the rest. Mm-hmm. But you dive into them a little differently. You use Garrison as the hook, who was a genuine radical by anyone's definition, mm-hmm. and a professional radical. Mm-hmm. But you are trying to show us that this problem of racism and anti-racism, it seems to me, and you correct me, you're trying to show us that this isn't just dividing people on who's either right or wrong, or even good or evil. It's ideas they don't even know they have sometimes. It's ideas that become part of a culture, part of a consciousness, part of a set of habits of mind, some of which are broken and beaten and maybe overcome, although you're suspicious of overcoming racism at all at times, and some which cannot be overcome. Talk a little bit about how you broke the abolitionists down for us. Because I can see you've had critics who have said, but wait a minute now, these people led a crusade that helped destroy slavery. Give them some credit. Well, you do give them credit. But talk about how you went at the abolitionists, not after, at the abolitionists.
So, I think you explained it.
No, I didn't explain it. No. You got 100 pages on the abolitionists, man.
I think to sort of recast one of the things that you stated, I found very early on in my research that there were racist ideas within conservative, liberal, and radical thought. That's the first sort of thing. And clearly, when we think of radical thought, and even for many people, liberal thought, people imagine that there are not racist ideas there. Well, I argue and I show how within these three intellectual traditions, you have ideas suggesting that there's something inferior about a particular racial group, but just coming from different perspectives. In other words, instead of, while conservative, so the other aspect of it is I decided very deliberately to write a history of racist ideas as opposed to racist. And when you talk about ideas, and I think I could probably speak for everyone in here as well as myself, when you talk about ideas, you're talking about a mind of contradictions, quite possibly. And so then it allows me, as an historian, to account for contradictions. Because I can, as you saw, I could take a speech, and at the beginning of the speech, Garrison would say the most anti-racist sort of ideas, making a case for why there should be immediate emancipation. But then when he starts talking about the harm of slavery and that they've made black people into brutes, and he's shocked that Douglass can write this well, like those types of ideas, now he's articulating racist ideas. So, you can say that he's articulating both because you're identifying one as one and the other as the other. And so that's why I was...
And both are different kinds of weapons.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that I wanted to also show is racist ideas have, in fact, moved people for the good, but it usually ended up in the long run for the bad. So to give an example, the belief that slavery was making black people into brutes was great to get people to oppose slavery, but then when slavery was over, these same people were saying, okay, we need to civilize and develop them. They're not ready, as Garrison stated, for their civil rights. So you see how it operates well in one arena and operates negatively in another. And I wanted to also sort of show that as well.
Okay. You do a very interesting job, too, a good job, not just interesting, with this whole phenomenon that went on for decades and decades of colonization. A lot of who become abolitionists cut their teeth, as Garrison cut his teeth as a colonizationist. Talk about that a little bit, because that's an idea, removal it never goes away in the 19th century. And to a degree, it has its revivals throughout the 20th and even now.
Well, again, I think...
As a solution somehow, you know.
Yeah, I think that clearly writing a history of racial ideas, the colonization movement was the most powerful and well-financed reform movement, even more so than abolition, of the 19th century. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this movement, these were, of course, there were many different strands, but generally speaking, colonizationists made the case that we should free black people and then basically send them back to Africa or send them to Haiti or send them somewhere other than here, because there's just no way that the racial groups can get along. And that argument was first made in a popular way by Thomas Jefferson. And so Thomas Jefferson was really the pioneer of colonizationist thought. And it was revived and became very prominent by the 1820s, and it really became the premier way in which people thought that they were alleviating slavery. So we'll do gradual abolition, and as we're emancipating these black people, we'll send them back. And it was a theory or an idea.
That's where Abraham Lincoln began.
Yeah, I was just about to, Abraham Lincoln tried early in his presidency to figure out a way to basically get rid of black people. Was even angry when a group of black men came to the White House and he said, for the best of the country, you should just voluntarily leave. And they were like, no. And he was like, you're not patriotic. And they were like, no. But the whole while was
Lincoln
trying to
had a bad day that day.
Yeah. But eventually, clearly it's very difficult to figure out a way to get rid of 2 million people in 1860s, right? You know, and even Jefferson realized you could put people on boats, but new people are being born. And so it's certainly, you probably just gonna have to deal with these people. But this idea was very important. And even the whole support for black people getting 40 acres and a mule, some of that support came from people articulating what they called internal colonization. In other words, we should set off a part of America for black people to sort of live. Now, black people were actually like, that's fine with us. So yeah, I mean, it was a very important, and I wanted to sort of show its many strands.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you one more, I think, important question, and then we are going to open this up. Because it's your center, the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center. You're, as I understand it, and you should explain it, you're developing a policy center. And part of your whole thrust is that racism itself may or may not be conquerable. But new policies can change the world. Or policies may change people faster than you can change people by ideas, by challenging their ideas. So you've created, and you argue at the end of Stamped, that it's the policies that have to be changed, revolutionized, worked on, more so than changing people's minds. That's an interesting position to take in a center about racism and anti-racism, although anti-racism is in the title of your center, not racism. But talk about that. Why that choice, and how were you doing that?
Sure. So that came out of Stamped from the beginning. I went into this book believing, as I'm sure many people do, that the source of racist ideas, in other words, the people who were producing these ideas were producing them because they hated black people or they just did not know black people. Mm-hmm. They were ignorant. So either ignorance or hate. And I should say that really this book was a history of the producers of racist ideas. I was very deliberate in focusing on people who were creating and producing ideas and really trying to understand and ask the question, okay, why were they producing these ideas at this time? Why did Jefferson make the case in 1785 that we should promote colonization, to give an example? And I found, and I didn't expect to find this, that many of these producers were producing these ideas were some of the most brilliant, by all accounts, American minds. And so these were, whether you're talking about Jefferson, whether you're talking about even John C. Calhoun, whether you're talking about, many of these figures were universally credited with being incredible thinkers, right? And so then that conflicts with this notion that these people were just ignorant, right? You also had people like Jefferson, who secretly was not hating black people. Y'all know what I'm talking about? And so how do you sort of account for this? And then I also saw, so ultimately, I mean, because I want to get to questions, what I found was that instead of these ideas coming out of ignorance and hate, they were actually coming out of a need to justify racist policies that typically benefited these people. And so I found racist policies being instituted and then benefiting people, and then those policies leading to racial inequity. And then there's only two ways to explain racial inequity. Either there's something wrong with people or policy, and then them saying, no, it's not our policies, it's those inferior people, and then people consuming those ideas. So I distinguish between the producers and the consumers of racist ideas, and then people becoming ignorant and hateful. And so what that means ultimately is instead of racist ideas leading to racist policies have led to racist ideas. And so if we really want to eliminate racism, and if you think of racism as this sort of marriage of racist ideas and policies, it's probably better to focus on eliminating the policies than on the ideas.
It's actually a fascinating approach. I mean, we don't stop and think too often that slavery was a policy with a deep legal, political, structural base to it. It was a policy. So were a lot of other things. I'm dying to ask you how you think about the idea of human progress, but maybe someone out there will. So you don't have to. So it's time for questions. We have 2 microphones up here. Could we have someone just lift them and carry them around and hand them up the aisle? Or you start right here in the front. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I thoroughly enjoyed the book. Beautiful, fascinating. I had to write this down because in the first chapter you described the problem in the first place, or part of the problem, in the sense you started that Aristotle concocted a climate theory to justify Greek superiority and that it was in turn adopted by the Romans. But I want to know, was Francis Bernier and other European writers knowingly denying their own native tribal identities that were impaled by Roman conquest, and then when in turn they subjugated other people, did the same and expected them to follow Constantine's edicts as true as they did?
So of course I can't say definitively, what he knew or didn't know or what he was doing, but I mean, clearly Francos Bernier, who scholars point to as really the first major racial classifier. So I think it was in 1685, he sort of classified the white race, the black race, the Asian race. And that sort of classification was the classification that Carl Linnaeus leaned on in 1735 to further classify the races, a classification that became dominant during the Enlightenment era. So I'm not sure, but what I do know is clearly, if you look at Europe, just like you look at any other place or continent around the world, you see many different ethnicities, tribes, however you want to describe it, and you see many differences, right, in not only cultural, but even the way people look within Europe. And so if you are basically classifying all of these people as one people, then you're fundamentally denying that. So I can't say it based on anything he said, but based on his ideas, I could probably make that case.
Next. Yes, sir.
How you doing, Professor Kendi? I know you're at American University, and I formerly used to live in Washington, D.C., Howard University. I know your family. I won't call that inside joke. So,
You know,
with being in Washington, D.C., how do these ideologies that you speak of flow into things like gentrification, which I know you see on a regular basis? I know most recently they've closed Liberty Congregational and Metropolitan, so formerly African-American institutions are being shut down. We know the people have already been moved out, over the past 20 years, but now even institutions that people would come into Washington to visit are being closed down. So what ideologies, based on this, assimilationist, segregationist, flow into that gentrification that we see in places like Washington, D.C.?
So you just used the word gentrification in DC. It's boiling right now. And so I'm happy to be talking about it here as opposed to there. But one thing I'll say, to be very quick, is one type of racist idea that I did not really chronicle as much in Stand from the Beginning, that I have a whole chapter on in the text that I'm writing now, is what I'm loosely calling space racism. And for those of you who are familiar with the Brown v. Board of Education decision, this was a decision that essentially stated that segregated schools, meaning colored schools, are having a detrimental effect on colored children. There was not a similar rationale by the court that white schools were having a detrimental effect on white children. And so what emerged out of this was this idea of segregated spaces being majority people of color, and integrated spaces being spaces where it's majority white, and segregated spaces being inferior, and these, quote, integrated spaces being superior. And so I'm sure you can imagine sort of how those constructs play out in the construct of gentrification. And you mentioned the church that was sort of taken over. Well, some integrationists would argue that now it's going to be made better because it's no longer a segregated church.
Next. Back here. Oh, back row. Yes. Please.
Thank you for your talk, Professor Kendi. Big fan of your work. I've read both of your books in my time as a master's student and now doctoral student. I guess there's two questions I have. One is, given how you call out the intellectual canon of most academic disciplines, I'm curious.
I didn't do that on purpose. It just happened.
People outside of history, I guess, have responded to your questioning some of the legitimacy of some of those people. So I guess that's one question. And then the second question I'm asking, because I have read Black Campus Movement, is when I hear you say there's a need for policy, right? There's a need for policy to rectify where we are.
Mm-hmm.
If someone had not read Black Campus Movement, they might think of you literally just saying, oh, like you just need to go propose this legislation, propose this initiative, But when I hear you say that, what I think of is, not just something where it's about what's happening with legal actors, but it's about kind of the cultural movement in tandem with the development of a particular, initiative.
Mm-hmm.
But what I'm curious is that what you're actually saying? Because I think in thinking about, if someone were to come up with a particular policy tomorrow, but we're not to also address like the remnants of like segregationist or assimilationist rhetoric that kind of is already spinning out in the world, that policy might not go far. So I guess I was curious more if you could talk about, like, when you talk about policy development, you talk about new policy implementation, like what are the different spheres that you're thinking of?
Sure. So in terms of the first question, there's primarily been radio silence. And in terms of, so I haven't heard from people trying to defend the originators of their disciplines. And I mean, we could certainly debate the reasons why, but I just wanted sort of to answer that question directly. I think in terms of and I should also add, so the first right of the text was much, much longer, and I actually had to cut out a lot of the history of scientific racism, particularly in the founding of disciplines, for a number of different, well, I should say it was cut out. And so maybe if I would have had more and I would have actually sort of really documented how many of the founders of almost every American discipline was a segregationist, not even assimilationist, I think there probably would have been more pushback from those who, but many of these founders aren't actually taught as founders, which is another issue. And so when you think about founders, I'm thinking about literally the institutional founders, like who created the first journals, who were the first president of the organizations. I mean, these were the people who founded the first departments, were the first major professors. Typically, most of these disciplines aren't looking at these people as founders. They're looking at people who they enjoy their ideas more. The second question, very quickly, so I think this is something that I certainly struggle with, because one of the reasons why I use the term policy is because I feel like it's all-encompassing. But at the same time, I think when some people think about policy, as you stated, they think of in the way you sort of described. I think when I think of policy, I should say that I define a racist policy as any policy that leads to racial inequity. It's very simple. And anti-racist policies as any policies that lead to racial equity. So it's very sort of simple. So, and then you can look at any policy, whether it's an admission policy, whether it's a hiring policy, and sort of see whether it's causing racial inequity but not only in terms of those types of policy. I mean, we have all unofficial policies in our homes, in our communities, in our social spaces. And so really I want people to think as broadly as possible, because really groups of people are governed by policies that are written and unwritten, legal and illegal.
Yes, back here in the blue shirt, and then we'll come up in the middle right here.
Thank you so much for the talk. While we're still on the policy part, coming from development field, I find that most of the times we can get the policy right. That's easy to get, but to change people's attitudes is always the hardest thing. And I'm wondering, as much as I would like to see anti-racist policies put in place, I wonder how you think about people's attitudes. Do you think policy can as well influence that and change it for the long run, and how so? Thank you.
So again, I try to answer these questions not necessarily based in our own moment, but I try to look at it from an historical perspective. And probably the most obvious example is in recent history is the relationship between the policy and the idea of interracial marriage. And so when interracial marriage became constitutional, a large segment of Americans was against interracial marriage in 1967. What has happened since then? And of course, there was a massive reaction to that from those people who didn't like it. But what's happened since then? You've had, at least according to polls, people becoming more and more accepting over the last 50 years of interracial marriage. Now, we could have been like, okay, let's actually convince people that this is okay. But I think it would have taken much longer. And so I actually think that, and even when we look at slavery, so when you look at attitudes about slavery in 1890 versus in 1850, people are more actually likely in 1890, and this is more anecdotal because there's no real polling. It seems to me that people were more of the belief that black people were not fit fundamentally for slavery in 1890 than they were in 1850. And so this is, and I tried to talk a little bit about this in Stand from the beginning, but one thing we should understand as it relates to ideas. So these ideas that people have, this isn't necessarily a static sort of thing. What's happening, and you have people producing the ideas constantly to make people believe that there's something wrong with a particular racial group. And we see this, of course, from people in Washington, D.C. pretty regularly, right? And they have a specific political or economic or even cultural interest in doing so. And so one analogy that I like to use is that you could, like, let's say if somebody is shooting you with a hose of racist ideas, you could certainly focus on drying that person off, or you could do what? Turn off the hose. And if the policy and the need to justify the policy, I need to justify voter ID laws with this idea of voter fraud, right? If you eliminate the policy, you're essentially turning off the hose. And then you can simultaneously reduce the damage and then start to dry the person off.
But you still have to convince human beings to change the policy.
Oh yeah, which is another, and that's largely came through struggle,
This damn species we're part of. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so I think my question is a little bit of a follow-up of that. You were citing at the beginning Abraham Lincoln saying that the country would either become pro-slavery or anti-slavery. And truly, slavery never went away. It just transformed into a different, pervasive way of slavery. So to some extent, it makes me think that racist ideas will never go away. They may just transform into something else, or I don't know. So I guess my question is, and I am not a historian, but from the time I've been doing activism, something that I came to realize is if there is something good we can get from the current administration is how it made very clear, very open, how pervasive racist ideas are still in the US and how prevalent they are in the policy. So I don't know if this is just a cynic way of trying to see where things are going, but I kind of would like to hear your opinion about, do you think that we're going somewhere, that all that is happening right now to some extent may come to something positive at some point?
Are you looking for hope? Always a good idea. Sorry, go ahead.
No, it's cool. So, I mean, I will say that you're absolutely correct in terms of what some scholars, have called slavery by another name, or journalists, or worse than slavery, in terms of convict lease system, or certainly mass incarceration. But we should understand that that's still different than chattel slavery. And so how do we sort of account for literally chattel slavery ending, and 4 million people being freed or freeing themselves, but then a simultaneous installation of convict leasing, and then of course we know what's happened in the last 50 years. How do we account for both things happening simultaneously? And what I argue, and I try to make the case in Stand from the beginning, that, and I should also say that, as many of you know, young people and older people are arguing, and have been arguing for a while, about whether there's been progress, right? Anybody know what I'm talking about, right? And both have great arguments, right? And I think that both are actually correct. And so what has actually happened is you've had both racial progress and racist progress. And so I try to track this dueling history. And you have activists who are constantly sort of breaking down racial barriers and breaking down or eliminating racist policies, but then those who are benefiting from those policies figuring out new ways to erect new ones, and typically they're more sophisticated than the policies they replace. So that's literally a progression, right? The policy becoming ever more sophisticated. And so I track that dueling history, I think, in STEM from the beginning. And so really, we've had both racial and racist progress. And in terms of hope, I do think in order to believe, in order to bring about change, you have to believe it's possible. And I think all of the greatest activists in history believed in the possibilities of change. And so to me, I think from a philosophical perspective, despite everything that's happening, I think it's hard to truly bring about change and to do all of the hard things it takes if you don't even believe it's possible.
You know, I've always loved that answer, both. Most people don't. I mean, we'd like to know it's that or that, but these historians are always kind of telling us it's both. And we don't like, Americans don't like both. No. They like their progress linear. Seriously, there are some things unique about the way Americans think about it.
The Hollywood history.
Well, our history's supposed to be going somewhere. It's out there. There are other countries where they don't necessarily believe that. We're live streaming this, and I just got the signal that we have a good question off Facebook.
Yes, we do. We have a question from Latanya Autry. She asks, I'd love to hear Dr. Kendi address intersectionality. In her book, Freedom is a Constant Struggle, Angela Davis made a point about stressing anti-racism that is aligned with anti-sexism and anti-poverty. If you could say something.
Sure. So I think in the prologue, I sort of cite and talk about Kimberly Crenshaw and her theory of intersectionality because it's central to the definition of a racist idea. The whole notion of a racial group is the sort of recognition that black people are a collection of intersectional sort of racialized groups. And then in understanding that, you begin to see this history of gender racism, as it's been called, queer racism, class racism. What I'm talking about is sort of the intersection as it relates to gender racism of sexist and racist ideas. The sort of, as it relates to this notion that the sexist idea that women are weak, and the racist idea that black women are not really women intersect to create this idea of the strong black woman that is inferior to the pinnacle of womanhood, which is the weak white woman. See how that sort of operates. And so then you have those two constructs, and it flips around as it relates to black men and white men. So, the real superior men are strong, right? Black men are not really men. And so those ideas intersect to create this idea of the strong superior white man superior to the weak black man. And so these constructs of the strong black masculine woman and the weak black feminine man constantly sort of dominate throughout the history of racist ideas. And then you see the same thing as it relates to homosexuality, notions of homosexuals as hypersexual, notions of black people as hypersexual, intersect to create notions that black gays and lesbians are more hypersexual than black heterosexuals and white gays and lesbians. So everybody sort of see how that happens. So this is another reason why the book was a little bit longer, because I had to account, I had to account for all of these sort of intersectional groups and the ideas that have been created about them.
I think we have another question right back here. Or no, where am I? Oh, right here, sorry. You have the mic.
Hi, thanks for coming and putting up with this instead of just saying, read the book. Appreciate it. I didn't read the book. Did you talk about affirmative action directly in the book?
So I talked about it in terms of the argument against affirmative action. I specifically, I think probably in the most length, I talk about the Bakke case, And I specifically, well, let me not give it away, but I make the case, and this I'll give you a teaser without giving it away, that Bakke should not have been the person who was on trial making the case that he was being discriminated against. That's another person or persons should have been on trial making the case that the current set of policies were discriminating against them. Anybody want to take a guess what policies I'm thinking about, talking about? So, as you know,
Failed that quiz.
the Bakke case, and I guess the court and the major decision, the majority decision, creates this sort of division between race-conscious and race-neutral policies. Does anybody want to shout out a so-called race-neutral policy? Anybody?
Public school.
I'm sorry?
Healthcare for all.
Well, in the case of MCATs, because of course Bakke was applying to medical school, is that a race-neutral policy? Is that and so, I try to sort of discuss and show who created the construct of race-neutral, even though the policy itself was creating racial inequity.
So standardized testing.
Yes.
Is
and that
table,
is
so.
precisely, after I show who created standardized tests, eugenicists.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I don't know if you're on to me, but the reason I asked is because you spelled it out pretty clear that you felt like any ideology that holds a race superior or inferior are by definition racist.
Say that again?
Any ideology that holds one race superior or inferior is by definition racist.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just trying to figure out, then if a policy is designed to specifically benefit black people, is it most likely racist because it presumes some kind of race-based deficit that needs to be fixed? And then how did that, just chase it out? I'm just really actually curious, do you support affirmative action? No.
Sure. So I think when it comes to, let's talk about discrimination. So there's actually discrimination, there's a racist and an anti-racist form of discrimination. And when people think of discrimination, they think about it as purely racist. But when you actually think about, there's actually two ways in which discrimination works. One form of discrimination creates equity. Another form of discrimination creates inequity. One form of discrimination repairs inequity of the past. The other form of discrimination does quite the opposite. And the reason why I don't really want to talk about, because I actually talk about this in my book, and the book I'm writing now, and I have it more sort of, it's more polished, but I think it's critical because I think people who have advocated for racial justice, I think it's critical, they typically push back against the idea that affirmative action is a form of discrimination. And I think, and so those who have a basic knowledge of discrimination, it's hard for them to see how that's not discrimination. And so I don't push back against that. I say, yeah, that is discrimination, actually anti-racist discrimination. And that we need, and it's impossible to create equity when there's past discrimination without present discrimination. It's impossible. And I think anybody can think about any room, right, in which you have all white people, right, and only a set number of seats. How do you create equity in that room? How do you create equity in that room without excluding some white people? And ideally, we would broaden the room, right, and create more seats, but how do you do that?
And that may be a more honest way of talking about it than just avoiding it. Yeah. We can take at least one more. Yes, Karen.
So I want to just sort of follow up with that.
Why don't you get the mic, because we're trying to tape it. Thanks, Melissa.
I'm interested in the affirmative action question too, and it might be, and I think this is what is going on here at Yale too, is that the MCAT is, if we look at it this way, the MCAT is a racist test.
Yes.
And that if we drop the MCAT or reduce it in its influence and in terms of admissions, then we can use other standards to make measurements as to how to bring people in. And this would, but the problem is over the past 50 years, the MCAT and the SAT and the GRE and all of these other standardized tests have become the one and single only standard in people's minds as to where they need to rank in order to get into a university. And so we have taken this racist measurement and sexist measurement that is where we think, or people think, that it is the one and only way that we can measure a student's intelligence. And so some schools are starting to either reduce the influence of the MCAT, and Yale is being criticized for this right now, or SAT or whatever. And some schools are dropping these tests entirely. I think that's partially what they're trying to do, is they're trying to drop what they see as, I don't know if they would say it's a racist test. So I'd like to know a little bit more about how your center is, and I think this is where the other questioner was going to. Where's your center focusing on policy in terms of affirmative action?
So I guess David had asked me to comment on center, and I
Sure.
did not. I'm sorry, so thank you for giving me this opportunity. I mean, the center is organized around 6 different sort of policy areas: education, environment, economy, justice, health, and politics. And the goal ultimately is to build these fellowship programs in those 6 areas that would allow us to team up to tackle a major inequity in that specific area, a team of a scholar, a policy maker, an activist, and a journalist. And these 4 professionals would each teach courses at AU. Their students would become almost like their research assistants. And they would do everything from investigating a racial inequity that we've already identified, and we've chosen them to actually sort of tackle it because that's their expertise. Investigating in all of its intersections to figuring out, okay, what are the racist policies causing this racial inequity, to innovating corrective policies, to disseminating those innovations and the research undergirding them, all leading up to a campaign of change that would literally figure out a local partner to work with to implement those policies, or create a campaign of change that would potentially force the implementation of those policies. And so really that's the sort of main thrust. Certainly at a particular point in time, one of the issues the ed team I would like for them to tackle would be this question of standardized testing. And I would say that, again, standardized tests create racial inequity. And I think everybody would agree with that. But then what happens is we think that means that Black people, Latinx people, Native people are the problem, as opposed to the tests themselves. And so what if we say, okay, you know what, these groups are equal, so it must mean that something's wrong with the test and not the people. Maybe there's no such thing as an achievement gap. But of course, those who benefit from those tests, because they're able to get into Yale, because their parents are able to pay for a high-priced tutor that boosts their score 300 points, but then of course, and then they imagine that they're smarter than the kid who got 200 points less than them. You see that math in there, right? And they'll never tell anybody about that, right? But at the same time, it's smart to be taking advantage of that, right? We also know that standardized test prep programs and facilities are concentrated in white and Asian neighborhoods. And so so I think people can understand why they get higher scores than other groups of people. I took the GRE and took a Kaplan course, and it boosted my score. And I actually write a little bit about that in my current book. And so everybody knows these tests fundamentally on their own are not tests that literally are able to measure intelligence, because the MCAT really only shows how you're going to do your first year. And so in the case of Baki, and this is what I write about. So one of the things that the lawyers did is they found that the students who were receiving the quote quotas had lower MCAT scores, but they were just as likely to graduate and get licensed. So, I mean, everybody understand that. So, but the test was, I would argue, discriminating against them. Right? Because they, and black people of color, even though we're just as likely to graduate and get licensed. I mean, what is the purpose of a professional school if it's not to graduate and get licensed and go on to a good career? They didn't have as much access to these opportunities because of this barrier test as other people.
I had terrible GRE scores. I should have taken that Kaplan test. Damn. One last quick question, and then we got to wrap it up.
While anti-racist discrimination is indeed right, isn't the question the number of seats in the room?
That is,
the ultimate policy that would be anti-racist would be to challenge the limited number of seats and to create a much more equitable society based on socialism.
I had a hunch you were going.
So I'm happy you say this, because I think you begin to see, particularly, we talked earlier about intersectional theory. And so it's very difficult for someone to look upon, for instance, black women as equal to black men if they're not a feminist, right? And so it's very difficult for people to not look upon the black poor as equal to black elites if they're not a socialist. And so you begin to see how these other sort of ideologies, for the lack of a better term, are crucial in terms of people articulating notions of equality between racial groups. And so I think in order to truly create an anti-racist society, you would have to create a larger room. I completely agree, and that's why I said that. Like, that would be the first sort of thing. You create the larger room. But I was just saying, in lieu of that, right, how do you create an equity if you're not creating that larger room? And that larger room, and I think this is the key, would not just benefit black people, it would benefit people of color, it would benefit white people. And I think one of the most glaring misconceptions about racism is that it has actually materially benefited all white people equally, and that generally speaking, it benefits white people. And you begin to see, when you study the way in which, and we see this over the last sort of 40 and 50 years, in the way in which people using racist ideas have climbed into positions of power, and they've used those positions to essentially benefit a particular class, and that has harmed not only people of color, but that's harmed the white middle class, who largely put them in power, because they were manipulated by racist ideas, which those people knew they could manipulate them by. Right, and so you see that happening. And so I think I wanted people to sort of see the way in which anti-racism is not just beneficial for people of color, it's most beneficial for them, but it's certainly beneficial for all people, except, of course, a very small group of super rich.
This country created a bigger room. It's called the public school and the public university.
Yeah.
But they're in trouble. I wouldn't have an education without public schools and public universities. I say this here at Yale. Dare I say this here? But anyway, I think we're going to have to wrap this. I want you to join me in thanking. You got to run out the door. I really am sorry. You got to acknowledge your thing. Thank you all for coming. Go get some time. Congratulations. All the best.